You will do exactly as I say. If you ask to leave, I will say no. You will behave as I expect you to. Do not cross me. Do you like power? We cannot physically abuse or torture them. We can create boredom. We can create a sense of frustration. We can create fear in them to some degree. We have total power in the situation. They have none. He was dragged by police out of his house onto the front garden. His family watching, his neighbours watching. He was thrown up against a police car, handcuffed, read his rights and placed in the back seat of the car. With the eyes of his family and his neighbours watching him, he was driven away by police. They had no idea what he could have done wrong. Here's the thing. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had replied to an advert in the newspaper and been selected. And being arrested and taken away was just the beginning of the experiment. Welcome to Extraordinary Stories Podcast. Hey, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Okay, here we are with another story to tell. I must just say a quick thanks to Stephen Squance, who, I hope that's how you say that surname, I hope so, who reminded me about this story, because I had this one on a list for a long time, and when Stephen reminded me of it, I thought, do you know what, I'll bump that up the list, I'll do that. Just before we got on the story, just a little bit of listener correspondence, which is interesting because there's been a lot of chat this week. I've seen it online and just various places about the Scottish accent. So I wanted to just share this email that I got. It's very quick. Okay, it's from Joanne in Portland, Oregon. It starts, Dear Barry and Alfie. Well, I mean, Joanne, that's an issue straight away. Why is Alfie getting a shout out? Emails addressed to Alfie? I don't think so. This is a one-man show. I'm the storyteller, not the daft dog. It's not called Extraordinary Stories Podcast with Barry and Alfie. No, it's not. So keep that in mind, please, everyone, for future correspondence. I'm the star of the show, not Alfie. So, Joanne says, now Joanne's from Portland, let's give Joanne an accent. She says, Hello, Barry and Alfie. Me and my friends have been discussing your podcast, which we really like. But one thing we're not sure about is, we know you're from the UK, but are you English, or are you Irish, or are you Scottish? We're not sure. Anyways, love the podcast. Love, Joanne. Can I get a shout out? Well, Joanne, that was your shout out, so I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you enjoyed my accent too. Now, Joanne, I feel like I might have made it quite obvious that I was Scottish, but I'll just clarify it. I definitely am, just in case that had been missed along the way or anyone wasn't sure. 100% Scottish, not Irish, not English, and certainly not Welsh. Okay, on with the story. Are you ready? Okay, let's go. I'll start with this statement. Anybody who is a clinician would know that I was faking it. If you listen to the tape, it's not subtle. I'm not that good at acting. I mean, I think I do a fairly good job, but I'm more hysterical than psychotic if you really listen to the tape. Okay, what's this all about then? Well, in order to understand it, let's discuss a man called Dr. Zimbardo. Dr. Zimbardo is a psychology teacher at Stanford University in the late 60s, early 1970s. So he's a man in his 30s with an absolutely brilliant mind and a really long standing actually as an excellent teacher and psychologist. Some people perhaps found him to be a little bit extreme as a person, but he takes psychology very, very seriously. It's very much his passion. And he's really trying to push the field of psychology. He's constantly wanting to discover more about the human brain, more about human behaviour. He really wants to push the envelope. Now, Dr. Zimbardo, and before I continue, can we just note that he's got a name like a Bond villain? I mean, how much does Dr. Zimbardo sound like he should be in a James Bond film? I'm coming to get you, James Bond. Well, I don't think that's what Bond villains say, but I don't know what they say. I don't watch the Bond films, so that was a guess. And in some respects, he maybe is a bit of a Doctor Evil character in this story. So Zimbardo, as I said, he works at Stanford, well respected. And what does he want to do? Well, he wants to set up a social psychology experiment. He wants to look specifically at the following things: the psychological effects of perceived power and depersonalisation. That's a fancy Nancy way of saying that it's basically an experiment about power. Fine. Now, he thinks we're better to experiment with this idea than the prison system, or a fictional one, at least. So the idea Zimbardo has is to create a fictional prison into which he will place subjects and he will study their behaviour. Now, the idea to use this prison idea wasn't entirely Zimbardo's on his own. What he's going to do with it, yes, that is entirely his own, but the very first idea to use it isn't his. In fact, another psychologist had 2 years before, I think it was maybe 1968 or 69, had tried something similar, a little experiment about prison. And Zimbardo liked that experiment and thought, interestingly, I might want to do something like that, but I might want to make it bigger. So he was kind of coming after the idea, but what he would do is he would kind of go on to supersize it, essentially. He would go on to make it into a huge different experiment than it was, but essentially not really his own idea to start with. It's a bit like when Beyonce left Destiny's Child and everybody went, oh my god, she's such a rebel, and wow, great, she's breaking out as a solo artist. Well, yeah, but Geri Halliwell left the Spice Girls 10 years before that and had done it, so Zimbardo's just kind of just nicking someone else's idea, really. He said this: I had been conducting research for some years on de-individualisation, vandalism, dehumanisation. And these things illustrate the ease with which the ordinary person can engage in antisocial acts if you put them in situations where they become anonymous. They become less than human. They become objects. So he's really wanting Prison Experiment 2.0. How does he go about it? Well, the first thing he does is he puts an advert in the Stanford University newspaper, and it says, male students needed to participate in a psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 2 weeks, beginning August 14th. For further information and applications, go to room 249 in the Jordan Hall. And that was a room in Stanford University. Now, the first thing to note, when the males applied, they weren't given any more information than the words prison experiment. They weren't really given a great deal of details. The only sort of process that they went through was Zimbardo met with each applicant, and there's a really simple form which he went through with them, which basically said things like, are you on any medication at the moment? Have you ever been to a therapist? What age are you? Blah blah blah. Sort of fairly basic details, nothing too in-depth within that. Now every single person got the same form filled out for them, because for Zimbardo it didn't matter, he just wanted these bits of basic information about people to start with. Because what he decided is that he was going to have a total of 24 people, and he was going to split that 24 in half. Now, 12 of those people would become the guards within his prison experiment, and 12 of those people would become the prisoners within it. Now, how was he going to decide? You would think that perhaps maybe during those interviews or when people have applied, he was sussing people out and thinking, would they be a good guard or would they be a good prisoner? No, he wasn't. He decided who was what role basically by the flip of a coin. And that was it. It's interesting that, I think it's an interesting way, because he's this really seasoned expert psychologist, and he just decides that actually this experiment, nope, it's the flip of a coin. That simple. There was nothing in that application, that was there to determine how you feel about authority, or are you a subservient person, or none of that. It just comes down to the coin. Within the fiction of the prison, Dr. Zimbardo decided he was going to play the role of the warden, the sort of superintendent of the prison. And what he did is he roped in a few of his psychologist friends who also played various roles. They would come in and play some prison roles as well. I would love to have been cast in this. I'd be like, hey, Dr. Zimbardo, give me a part. Give me a role. Who would I want to be? I think I'd like to appear as a sassy lawyer who was like, hey man, I'm going to get you all out of jail. Look at me. No, actually, wait. I'm changing my mind. I'm lying. I think I'd like to be cast as a priest. That's who I'd want to be. I'd love to come in my robes and be like, tell me your sins, my son. That's the role I'd want within it. So, anyway, the men start applying. Zimbardo starts all of his applications, and he has got his 24. And now it's time to get his mock prison ready. So for that, he goes to the basement of Stanford University. He finds a disused area down there, and it's sort of long corridors with rooms going off it, and he thinks, this is going to be my makeshift prison. So he takes those little rooms and he turns them into 6x8 cells for each prisoner. Inside each cell, the prisoners only have a tiny little bed. That's it. Nothing else. He sets out an area for solitary confinement. He sets himself up in an area where he can oversee the whole entire experiment. He can watch everyone within it. And he gathers together his cast of players. So, he decides that he's going to go with these numbers. He's going to use 9 prisoners and 9 guards. And what that does is that gives him 3 extra guards and 3 extra prisoners who are, well, basically waiting backstage in case anyone gets ill or something goes wrong. So they're not really part of the main experiment. They're just kind of waiting in the wings. So he's got 9 and 9. A nice equal split. So it's all set to happen on the 14th of August, 1971. And on the 13th of August, the arrests begin. I mean, this is nuts. And how he got away with this, I don't know, because you just would not be allowed to do this right now. He actually gets the real police, the real Stanford police, involved to make the arrests. Because he wants the experience to be as authentic as possible, he wants those who he's decided by the flip of a coin are going to be the prisoners, he wants them either arrested on the street or in their home or somewhere public. So they can, and I quote, feel the real humiliation of being thrown against a cop car and taken away. So it's back to what I said in the beginning. People were literally in their houses. Police came knocking on the door to drag their son out of the house, out onto the front lawn, pushed them up against a police car, arrested them and took them away. And families were like, what the hell is going on? Why has my child been arrested? Why has my brother been arrested? Well, they hadn't. They were just taking part in a 2-week experiment. Interesting note about the participants. All 24 that Zimbardo chose were white and were all middle class. What's that about Zimbardo? Eh? Explain yourself. Well, he said he was going for white male Stanford student type because, this is what he said, those are the ones who are likely to end up being prison guards. What we're going to learn here about Zimbardo is he talks a lot of rubbish. As we go, we're going to learn that. So, the prisoners are being processed at the police station as if they had actually been, arrested. And while that's happening, Zimbardo meets with those who are going to act as the guards. And he says to them, you can create in the prisoners feelings of boredom. You can create a sense of fear to some degree. A notion of arbitrariness, that their whole life is completely controlled by us, by the system, by you and by me, and that they have no privacy. We're going to take away their individuality in various ways. I want them to feel powerless. That's it. In this situation, we have the power, and they have none. It's interesting because Zimbardo will try to say that he never said those words. However, someone taped him saying those words, and when that's played back to him, he does a lot of talking to try and get himself out of the situation, but essentially it's there on tape. That's what he said. What he wanted tough guards. He wanted them to be in charge. He wanted these tough guys. He didn't want no nice guards. And he's worried a little bit when the experiment begins that what he's got in front of him might just be a little bit too soft, these guards. But after all, it is an experiment, so he'll just have to see how that goes. So the guards, they get given prison guard uniforms. Sort of green, khaki, like a sort of jackety shirt, pair of trousers. They get given a little hat, and they get given wooden batons to complete their new persona. On the day that the experiment begins, Zimbardo gets the guards in place, and the prisoners are led in blindfolded. And immediately they're treated with disdain and loss of power. The first thing is they are stripped of all of their clothing, and they're given a smock to wear, which is deliberately really ill-fitting for each prisoner. I mean, it just does not fit them, and Zimbardo wanted that because he wanted them to be uncomfortable. I mean, these smocks, honestly, oh my god, they're like a dress, basically. It's like a short dress. It's awful. It barely covers their arses. Honestly, they're really exposing. It's like they're wearing a mini dress. It's honestly, it's just horrendous. But this is what he wanted. He was aiming for, in his words, demasculation. Demasculation. I don't even know what tune that is, but I just felt it. I felt it come up, felt it rise up from my soul. He gave them little hats, little nylon hats. Do you know what they look like? Do you know when just before someone puts a wig on, they put that little thing over to put all their hair in? Just looks like one of them. That's what he made them wear. And then a chain around their ankle. So I mean, that's some get up. That's some look that he's got them in there, isn't it? They get assigned a prison number, and that's what they would be called by the guards. So there's no names here in his experiment. They're just numbers. And again, that's there to remind them of their loss of identity. So it's all set. Here is everything that Zimbardo has created, and it's beginning. And day one happens. And what exactly goes down on day one? Well, not very much. Annoyingly for Zimbardo, little happens on that day. The prisoners kind of do as they're told. They sometimes try to challenge the guards in a bit of a jokey way. No, I'm not doing that. The guards get a little bit authoritarian with them. The prisoners back down. But overall, it's nothing to write home about. The guards are doing an okay job of keeping control, and it's all fine. But this is a psychological test, so can it stay that way? Well, no, it can't. Zimbardo talks to the guards, and he tells them, look, you can be a bit stricter with the prisoners. You're just playing it a bit nice at the moment. Let's mix that up. Really, I think the problem is with day one in this experiment is it really was just all a bit of a joke. You know, I think it all just felt a little bit too pretend. It was a bit play acting, not quite real. However, day two is going to arrive, and that's going to change. One of the prisoners, Douglas Corpy, he goes to the guards and he asks if he could be given his college textbooks in order to study. For this student, he was thinking, I might just do that experiment because basically I'll just be a prisoner for 2 weeks. I'll stay in my cell for 2 weeks, and what I'll do is I'll just read all my textbooks. However, when he goes and he asks the guard, he's told no, you can't have them. And that really pisses him off. So he starts to argue. He gets quite aggressive with the guard and he starts saying, I want my textbooks. And the guard gets aggressive back and says no. And it escalates into a shouting match between the two of them. And then the other prisoners begin to get involved. And now everyone's shouting, and the whole thing, it escalates until it's full scale, everyone screaming at each other. And the guards, for the first time, and it's only the second day, have to try and calm everything down. They have to try and get the prisoners back under control. They do by shouting really loudly at them, is essentially how they do it. So what's happened here in the experiment is quite interesting because actually it's moved from these guards being just that little bit too soft, a little bit too nice. They have to flip that now and be like, actually, if they're really going to start kicking off, we're going to have to really up how we're playing this as the guards. Now, Douglas Corpy, he gets marked as a troublemaker. A bad apple. Bad news. So, realising he's not getting his textbooks, Corpy fakes a severe stomachache and he asks if he can be let out to see a doctor, but the guards, they don't believe him. Now, he's on the floor of his cell, he's screaming in agony, he's writhing in pain, and they just tell him, "Shut up or you will be punished." They tell him he's going to be taken out of his cell and he'll be placed into solitary confinement if he creates any more of a ruckus. I love the word ruckus. All it does is it just makes Corpy angrier. And I think really what makes him angry is the fact that this is now his second attempt at breaking the fiction. And it's not worked. You know, he's really trying to cause the guards to kind of break a little bit with him here, and they're just not doing it. And it starts to creep in and cause a bit of unrest within the other prisoners in the experiment. I mean, this is a joke experiment, and it's now turning out to really not be that funny. They're not really being allowed to do things by the guards. You know, they're starting to really feel that actual loss of identity and control. Everything that, you know, Zimbardo wanted. 26 hours into the experiment, Douglas Corpy demands that he gets let out and is allowed to speak to someone higher than the guards because he just can't take it anymore. He speaks to Zimbardo, who's in his role as warden, and he says, "I need to get out." Zimbardo says, "You can't. You're not allowed. You signed up for this, so you're staying." And this just sends Douglas Corpy into a rage. He goes back to his cell, and what he does is he stirs up all the other prisoners. He starts saying, "Look, they are not going to let us out of here. This is not the joke that we thought it was. This is serious. They're going to actually keep us here." And the feeling that it was just now a little bit too real settled in. And after lots of screaming and shouting, and Corpy trying to really galvanise the other prisoners into a riot, Zimbardo finally says, "Right, okay, fine, let him out of his cell." And when they let him out, you know, he's treated really roughly by the guards. They bring him to Zimbardo a second time, and he screams and he cries like a tortured animal. He says, "I mean, Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside. Don't you understand? I want to get out. This is all fucked up. I can't stand another night. I just can't take it anymore." Zimbardo decides that Corpy is unwell for real, and he needs to be let out of the experiment. Now, this is only day 2, so it's a bit of a mess for Zimbardo's experiment, but then, you know, at least he can record that it didn't take long for someone to break. Corpy's released immediately, and another one of the prisoners who was waiting backstage gets to come in and take his place. But like I said, it's just created a really bad feeling. Realising that they're not allowed to leave, the prisoners decide that they're going to get together and they're going to stage an uprising. In the way that they don't like how Corby's been treated, what they do is they rip the numbers off of their smock dresses that they're wearing. They remove their headwear, and they block the doors to their cells with their mattresses. Now, it all just backfires on the prisoners. Zimbardo at this point is letting the guards just make up the rules. So what the guards do is this: they remove the prisoners' mattresses as a punishment, and the prisoners have to now just sleep on a cold floor. Then next the guards start taking food away from the prisoners as a punishment for bad behaviour. And so at this stage, you're only a couple of days in, but more and more prisoners are asking if they can get out. And in actual fact, they're begging the guards, can they get out of the experiment? Can they be taken to see Zimbardo, and can they just talk it through with him because they want out? And the answer is always no. You can't leave. One of the guards, who the prisoners call John Wayne, not his real name, he's worse than any of the other guards. And if the prisoners have to speak to any of the guards, he's the one that they want to speak to least. He's an absolute beast. He's a real, like, cock of the walk, loves himself, you know, like, cuts about with a fake southern accent, really taking his role seriously, wears, like, do you know, like, shiny mirrored sunglasses? Oh my god, mirrored sunglasses. No thanks. What year is it? Oh well, I suppose it was 1971, maybe they were fashionable. Anyway, this John Wayne prison guard, he is just a nightmare. He's really abusive to the prisoners. He calls them horrible names. He really gets into making them do just really degrading things in front of other prisoners and other prison guards. He forces some of the men to get into sexual positions and pretend that they're shagging each other, basically, so that when they bend over, you can see their junk, for want of a better way to say it. I hate the word junk, I don't know why I used that. The private parts are exposed. You know, he would make them do things like play leapfrog in those tiny little smock dresses that they're wearing, just so that their balls would hang out. Basically, he would do things like he would make them repeat their prisoner number over and over and over again, and he would make them get louder, and they had to shout it and scream it. And then he would do things like go into their prison cell, wake them up at 3 a.m. as they lie there sleeping on a cold hard floor. He would prod them till they woke up, and then he would scream in their face and tell them that they have to say their number over and over and over, and thank him and say, yes, thank you, prison officer, and all that shit. I mean, he just went nuts with the power. But here's the thing. Zimbardo encouraged it. He didn't stop this John Wayne type, or, in fact, any of the other guards, who by now are all getting a little bit out of control. Let's just go back, right? Just for reference, my friends, to what Zimbardo had to say at the very beginning. We cannot physically abuse or torture them. We can create boredom, a sense of frustration, fear to some degree. We have power, they have none. Now, nowhere in that does it say you can humiliate them beyond all belief. You can make this the most miserable days of their life. But yet, Zimbardo's not stopping it. So on day 3, something else is going to happen, which is going to just disrupt the whole entire thing. One of the men who's playing the role of guard arrives for his shift, and he has some news. There's a rumour going on in the outside real world that the first prisoner, Corpy, is planning to return with a whole group of people who intend on ripping the experiment apart. A group of people who are basically going to demolish the whole thing. So this just spreads utter panic through the downstairs basement of Stanford University. Zimbardo orders that everything from the prison be moved to the top floor of the building, where he's found another space which can be locked at either side. So it's like another long corridor. It can be locked to either side so that it could stop people getting in. So this is what he does. He uproots the whole entire prison that he's built downstairs, gets it moved upstairs, just in case this one guy that got out arrives with an angry mob to rip apart his experiment. However, it doesn't happen. Having moved the whole entire thing, no angry mob appears. I included that because I think that's an interesting bit of the story. I really do. I think it's so interesting, this sort of sense of fear that's felt on the third day by those who are running it. This paranoia. I mean, to me, why that stuck out like a sore thumb was I was thinking you wouldn't move it unless you wanted it hidden. You know, okay, Zimbardo could hide behind the fact of going, no, it needs to run, the experiment needs to run for a few days so that I can properly test the results. But at the same time, if you actually really believed your experiment was under control, you wouldn't be so panicked, I don't think, to move it somewhere that was locked and into a different location. And I think that's interesting. Which, when I was thinking about that, brought me to this point. Why was no one from the university checking up on this experiment? I think that's mental. I think it's crazy that no one thought, do you know what, I better just stick my head into that prison experiment and see what's happening. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine just being like, yeah, I'll be with you in a minute, Professor Bobbins. I'm just off to stick my head into the Zimbardo experiment, opening the door and being like, oh my god, what am I looking at? But it didn't happen. They were just left to it. By now, by day 4, it has turned really ugly. The guards are forcing the prisoners to wash the toilets using only their hands. Food is taken away from the prisoners regularly, and they're starving. Men are chained together and made to stay chained together wherever they go. Be that the toilet, be that to eat, they're forced to stay together. And then the guards decide they're just going to create this punishment for the prisoners. They're going to not let anyone actually use the toilet. Instead, they give them buckets in their cells, and the guards refuse to empty these buckets. Fucking disgusting. And so with all of this, is Zimbardo getting what he wants? Yeah, he is. He's really seeing human nature do its thing under his conditions. Those guards he was worried about in the beginning being too soft, well, they're not too soft now. And the thing is, these guards were and are nice guys. You know, nice students. But they're just way into this role. They're taking it too seriously. It's become hideously cruel. And the prisoners, again, you know, these are nice students who are usually quite calm people. You know, young guys in their early 20s now being forced to live like these hideous caged animals. And of course they're going to kick against that. Of course you are. On day 5, there's a prisoner who he just can't take it anymore. He's absolutely hit his limit with it, and he breaks down, hysterically crying. And so he's taken to see Zimbardo, and Zimbardo puts him in a quiet room within the prison setup. And he says to him, you can just sit in here for a while and you can chill out and get some sleep and, you know, remove yourself just in this little quiet space. You're still in the prison system, but, you know, just stay here. The guy's in the room for about 5 minutes on his own when the guards decide what they're going to do is they're going to get all the other prisoners to come stand outside the quiet room, and they're going to get them to chant, prisoner 816 did a bad thing, over and over and over. And what was that bad thing? Well, he cried, and that was the bad thing, and this was his punishment. And this just makes this poor guy start to lose his mind, and he has to be let out of the experiment. He would be the 4th prisoner to be let out who just couldn't take it. I mean, Dr. Zimbardo is losing prisoners all over the place here. Now, there's a huge discrepancy between the notion of being allowed out and not being allowed out. Zimbardo says, when I saw that they were at psychological breaking point. I made a few exceptions, and I let some go. He also says this, and this is bullshit. I warn you now, it's bullshit. He says they were free to go at any time. They simply had to say the words, "I want to quit the experiment." That was the line. That was all they had to say, and they could be freed. The safe word, if you will. Okay, why is that bullshit? Because none of the prisoners were ever told that. Never. It's not written down anywhere. Zimbardo never told it to them. The guards never told it to them. But he insists, I did tell them. They knew they just had to say basically the safe words, the line, and it would all be over. Absolute bollocks. That is not true. I mean, it seems a really bizarre thing to be confused about in a prison experiment. Someone's freedom. Anyway, by day 6, it's turned into just a hellish nightmare. The guards are completely out of control with power. The prisoners are starting to get ill through lack of food, the horrible conditions. But Zimbardo wants to push this to the 2-week limit. Let's just see, he's thinking, how far can I push human psychology? But that is until his girlfriend, Christina Maslach, a psychology graduate, pops in to see her boyfriend's experiment, and she has the reaction which I'm pretty sure we would all have. What the fuck is happening here? She sees these men in dirty dresses, they're chained together, they look ill from lack of food, lack of water. She looks at the whole setup, which is disgusting. She takes her boyfriend Zimbardo aside and she says to him, "This has to stop. This is going to turn deadly. Someone is going to get really ill, or there's going to be an injury, or something bad is going to happen if you don't stop this experiment." And it's interesting because what that does for Zimbardo is it actually snaps him out of being so lost in the minute by minute development that he realises this is actually a mess. This is a total chaotic mess. And so, on day 6, the experiment is brought to an end. The prisoners are freed. The guards are left to go out on their own, and the whole prison is dismantled, just as if it had never happened. Zimbardo goes on to the next task, which is writing up all of his findings. One mistake that Zimbardo had kind of made along the way here was he invited publicity from the very start for his experiment. He had allowed photographers and documentary makers to see a bit of what was going on in his prison dungeon. Now, can you imagine those images going out into the newspapers? Well, they don't read very well to the outside world. So when it's over, at the end of its 6 days, he has some serious explaining to do. And to be honest, he doesn't do it very well. He is a real man, as I said, of contradictions. What happens with Zimbardo is he changes his story all the time about the experiment. He talks a load of bobbins. He really tells so many different versions of what happened and who said what and what he said and what someone else did. And, he gets the story so confused. Zimbardo is still alive, still giving TED Talks and interviews to this day. He defies in interviews so much of what he set up. He says, "I never told the guards to ever be that harsh," and then somebody goes, "I'm just going to play you a little tape here, Zimbardo. It's you literally telling them to be more harsh." And he goes, "Well, yes, but you see," and then he just muddies the whole thing up. But then what's interesting is other people who were in the experiment also do the same thing. So remember Corpé, the very first prisoner to be freed? He says in interviews later, "The breakdown I had was manipulation to get out of the damned experiment. I put myself into that state of mental anguish, and it was traumatising for me to scream to do those things, but anyone who's a clinician would know that I was faking it. If you listen to that tape, it's not subtle. I'm not that good at acting. I sound more hysterical than I do psychotic. But then, of course, people change their story when, depending who's asking the questions. And, a few years after making that statement, he'll then say, oh no, I really was deeply affected in the 36 hours that I was in there. I really did have a psychotic break. Just keeps changing his story all the time. Then there's the John Wayne, the guard. He'll say, I was just play acting the whole time. I'm a really nice guy. I just wanted to have fun. No one was telling me to act like that. I just was doing it because, I wanted to get into the spirit of it. And I thought it might be nice to have a southern accent and be a bit harsh. Well, that's all well and good, but for you to say that, but those who went through those 6 days, they certainly did not have any fun. The Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment is written about and talked about so much today as it was back then. It's in every psychology textbook. I'm sure so many of you know this story and this experiment. I just think it's still fascinating. Even if you know it, even if you understand the story, it's still incredible. And what's incredible for me is that it was allowed to happen, that it was allowed to get that out of control and nobody stopped it. It's one of the very few extraordinary stories that I've told where no one died, which is great, and I'm so glad to say that about the story. But what a fucked up experiment that is. And so you can see why we still talk about it. And Zimbardo actually came out of it relatively fine. I mean, he ended up, I think, going to court at some point, and he, not for anything he'd done with this, but as a expert in prison behaviour. He sort of came out of it and actually got some fairly nice jobs out of it. He went on to write books about it. So it didn't really seem to harm his career. In fact, it kind of made his name bigger within the world of psychology. Let's end the story with some words spoken by one of those who was in the role of prisoner, who survived a very real, for him, a very real 6 days under the Stanford prison experiment. He said, "It was the worst thing I have ever experienced. I'm in my 60s now and I still remember those 6 days as hell on earth. I wish to God I'd never answered that advert." And so ends the story. Okay, well, what do you think? Crazy? I'd asked in the Facebook group the other day, I put a poll up about power and about whether or not we felt that we could lose power. Do we struggle with authority? I was asking people to just kind of really be honest and say, oh yeah, what do I think about that? Or could I do this kind of thing? I never named that this was the experiment, but I'm sort of getting at this idea of I'm interested. I'm really fascinated in this kind of idea of giving up your power. And then what do you do once you've done that? Do you regret the decision that you've done it? I can get someone like Corpy in that situation who goes, yeah, I just think I'm going to go in there for 2 weeks and read my textbooks, and then suddenly goes, shit, this is actually much more real than I realised. And it's what happens to your brain at that point that I think's interesting. I think that's the more interesting bit of it for me than the guards becoming real dickheads, because I think you could kind of predict that was going to happen. Well, I certainly think that's fairly obvious, that if you give people power, too much power, they will abuse it. I think it's more the psychology of, oh shit, this is real, that's more interesting. Anyway, what do I know? I'm just a storyteller. I'm not a psychologist. Okay, well, remember, I've got a Patreon if you want to, support the podcast and get more stories. I've got the merchandise as well if you want some, Extraordinary Stories podcast clobber. And remember to say hello on the social medias. Join the Facebook group. Say hello. Be lovely to speak to you. And you can email me and maybe I will read your email in your accent next time. Who knows? Alright, until the next story. Okay. Goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over.